Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this event, which is the final part of a Sadler series that is hosted by LAHRI at the University of Leeds and is on interdisciplinary perspectives around comics. I'm Miriam Kent. I'm a lecturer in film and media at Leeds, and I'm joined by my collaborators, Eirini, Boukla, who's a lecturer in art and design, and Rick Worth, who's a comic book writer and practitioner. So this event is called Who Cares for Comics, Graphic Medicine and Comic Art? And it features Kay Sohini and Jared Gardner in conversation. It's going to be a kind of conversational presentation exploring comics in relation to graphic medicine, so highlighting the intersection between sequential art and healthcare or medical issues and education. You're likely familiar with Jared and Kay anyway, but in case you aren't, Jared is Joseph V. Denny designated professor of English at Ohio State University, an expert in the history and narratology of comics. He is the author of the book Projections, Comics and the History of 21st Century Storytelling, and was the curator of an exhibition at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Museum, which was called Drawing Blood. Kay is a researcher and cartoonist based in New York, and she completed a comics form PhD thesis at Stony Brook University, which was called Drawing Unbelonging, Comics as Thinking, as Method, as Resistance. And her forthcoming graphic memoir is titled This Beautiful, Ridiculous City. And Kay has expertise in healthcare justice, race, gender, disability, and environmental inequality. So we're delighted to have you and welcome speakers. Just as a note, this is going to be a kind of part conversation, part Q&A. We're going to start with our speakers kind of introducing their work for a few minutes before getting to the discussion. We do anticipate that it should last around an hour. We have overrun slightly in the past because the discussions tend to get quite lively. So please feel free to duck out if you need to. We will be recording the event and circulating the recording afterwards. Cameras will remain off, but we'll open up the chat later on, and also the Q&A function will remain open. We've also enabled the live transcription function, so please make use of that if you need to. But yeah, I'm going to hand over to Kay, first of all, who's going to kind of outline some of her really interesting work.
Thank you. And let me just try and share my screen. I'm sorry about that. Okay, that seems to. Okay, so hi, hello everyone. My name is Kay Sohini, and as Miriam said, I'm a full-time comics maker based in New York, but I'm traveling right now and kind of super jet lagged, which is why if I sound tired, I'm sorry about that. I came to comics from academia. I was pursuing a PhD in 2017 from Stony Brook University when I began engaging with works like Nix's Annis's Unflattening and Linda Barry's works. And for some reason, I was convinced that, like Nick, I want to draw my doctoral dissertation. And somehow I was allowed to by my exceptionally supportive dissertation mentors, advisors. But I didn't know how to draw, so I had to, spend a couple of years just teaching myself how to do it, and especially not just how to draw, but how to make comics specifically. I did take a figure drawing class at Teachers College, Columbia, but most of what I learned was picked up from just reading comics a lot. And in my time of, just reading a lot of comics, like literally hundreds of comics, I found that formal innovations in the medium, such as like the DeLuca effect, or how time and space are about the same, and then how the juxtapositions can sort of like layer meaning, like those kind of like really technical things fascinate me a lot. So I wanted to experiment with the formal features of the comics medium. and sort of like to use those to explore topics related to race, diaspora, and belonging, which was the subjects of my dissertation. But then in early 2020, the pandemic happened. And then shortly after, my grandmother died, and I couldn't go see her because, well, it was a different country and travel was restricted. So I ended up writing a short comic for that was sort of like later collected in Graphic Monday's COVID Chronicles anthology. And then a year later, I wrote this another comic for the Nibs Nature issue, which was my first properly researched nonfiction comic on the intersection of health and justice, health and environmental justice. Eventually, I just sort of realized that my work was increasingly becoming graphic medicine centric, but only in the broader sense of the term, because so for example, like last year, I think I have to like I was supposed to be going through the slides. I forgot. Sorry about that. But these were there. So yeah, so only in the broader sense of the term, because like for example, like last year I had the opportunity to collaborate with Ruby Mellon and Hannah Good at the Washington Post to co-write and illustrate this comic on how India's growing population and how climate change is affecting the region's food production and how it is going to have severe repercussions on the lives and livelihood of those impacted in the region. So essentially what I like to do is translate scientific research into stories and use creative data visualizations in my work. I've also been drawing, there's an upcoming exhibition at Virginia Tech called COVID Comics Cube. So I've been drawing this sort of like snippets from the pandemic for it. This one here is uses Deluca effect, which is one of my favorite things about comic, to capture pandemic isolation. And outside of that, I guess my most significant project has been my first book. Shortly after graduating, I landed a book contract with Jonathan Cape for This Beautiful, Ridiculous City. And it's out in about now, I think 7.5 months. And it's a graphic memoir about cultural influences in a post-colonial nation, the impact of abuse on memory, moving across the world to New York, where housing is precarious, and of course, the contingencies of belonging, which is something I've been talking about for the last 7 years. I think one of my favorite aspects of making comics is being able to creatively refer to your literary inspirations and literary heroes through like visual references. And here on this page here, let me find it. Okay, here. So here on this page here on the right side, you can probably see Alison Bechdel popping onto the train. And it's actually a reference to a scene from Are You My Mother? And what I find particularly fascinating is the way we can sort of just incorporate literary references in a way that's simultaneously a tribute to the original work and also generative for the text in very surprising ways. I found that building on the contributions of those who came before us and those who paved the way, like takes this really lively and dynamic approach within the image textuality of the medium. So for example, in this next drawing here, I'm not sure how much you can see it because it's super small, but in this next drawing here, I try to capture the sort of multiverse-like nature of comics and graphic medicine, the movement and the medium, with tribute to Art Spiegelman, Linda Barry, Bechdel, David Small, as well as references to newer works such as Sarah LAHRI's Coma. And I draw attention to the various ways in which the medium has been utilized to narrate trauma, illness, disability, war, and genocide. I chose works that were formative in my understanding of the medium and newer works that continue to push the boundaries of the medium formally and otherwise. But I guess what I really want to say here is that the fact that one can make sense of one's life through literature, be it through affordances or through solidarity, is kind of like magical to me. And of course, this happens in prose too, but over time, I've become less interested in what other media cannot do and more invested in figuring out what comics can do spectacularly. I think all creative mediums are capable of pushing boundaries, and that's sort of what I'm really interested in to experiment and find out through practice. I'm also currently working on a book on grief and grief time, what I call grief time and intergenerational trauma. A super short excerpt of it was published in ASAP last year, so you can look that up online. But essentially, I'm trying to tap into this time-space magic of comics to map how time shapes us and how it affects our memories, how our relationships with each other, and how trauma is passed down intergenerationally. Because at the end of the day, I really do believe that comics can manipulate our perception of time with spatial reorganization on the page and evoke a sort of like sense of urgency through its composite medium. I'm also currently collaborating with Dr. David Lowe at University of California, Riverside School of Medicine on this a very research-based book on the environmental and health crisis currently unfolding at the Salton Sea. So we look at how the lake was formed, how it turned from like this agricultural oasis into a toxic wasteland, how it's currently a health hazard for marginalized communities, largely Latino, Hispanic immigrant farm workers and indigenous people who live on the borders of the Salton Sea, and how the environmental degradation has sort of led to a very high incidence of childhood asthma, specifically in the region. I think it's like 30% more than the national average, so which is kind of like frightening. So this project is based on decades of research by David and his team, and it's an incredibly complex subject and kind of like the perfect opportunity for me to really use the comics medium to visualize all that data and make a story out of it, and to really show to a larger audience what a larger audience outside climate scientists, to how global rising temperatures have severe impacts on local ecosystems and what is at stake. So I guess what I'm really trying to say is like, I am interested in how we can use comics to make visible complex interconnections between health and environmental and social economical factors. And I guess optimistically to imagine a better, more inclusive world. This is another one of the panels, like work in progress panels from the Salton Sea project. And as I've written on the slide here, my goal is to use comics not just as an illustrative tool to supplement the text, but as a method to think, strategize, find patterns, give form to an inchoate idea through investigative drawing, and develop a deeper understanding of how the visual grammar of comics can be utilized to map the connection between public health challenges of our time, socioeconomic, racial, and environmental inequality. That's, I think, all from me, but I look forward to Jared's bit and also to answering any questions that you may have.
I mean, you just blew me away, Kay, by saying that you self-taught as you're preparing for your PhD, because I am a huge fan of your art. I tried to self-teach and did not end up where you are. So just beautiful work, and very excited about the work on grief that you are doing now, which relates to some things that I've been thinking about a lot as well. So I'm just gonna quickly share my screen, and give me 1 second. There we go. Everybody see the slide there?
Yeah.
Great. So I wanted to just say a little bit. I am like Kay, but from especially from the I can't draw worth a damn, as my artist parents always like to remind me. I am kind of coming from the kind of textual scholarly side, but very much a visual learner, and I have personally benefited greatly from graphic medicine and this kind of turn inwards around the comics medium by caregivers, patients, patient advocates, public health workers, cartoonists, scholars, and allies. And I'll say a couple of words about that. The graphic medicine movement, for those who don't know it, and I think of it as a movement associated with, but not identical to, the narrative medicine movement. Narrative medicine was, there's a bunch of people who were instrumental in kind of what came to be known as narrative medicine, but I think Rita Sharon at Columbia deserves pride of place. It was a call for something that I think many of us had come to recognize, which is that with the rise of electronic medical records and increasingly remarkable digital imaging technologies of the human body and other metrics and quote unquote objective data, that patients' own stories had kind of disappeared from the doctor-patient interaction. And this group of folks, folks from the US and the UK, kind of came together over a course of years, began as a working group and then as an annual conference, which I encourage everybody to visit. It is a remarkable space where people from a range of perspectives come and talk about medicine through the common language of comics. So I was giving a talk at a medical humanities panel that was at my university. I was on a panel with Michael Green, who is a professor of medicine at Penn State, and who had been using comics with his medical students, continues to do so. I encourage you to seek out his work and his students' work. I was giving a talk about my experience. I had just begun to really been on for about a year the medical diagnostic merry-go-round. I was struggling with what eventually would be diagnosed as chronic illness, what in the United States we insist on calling by the incredibly dismissive name chronic fatigue syndrome. I much prefer the UK nomenclature, but that remains unintelligible to people in the States, sadly. Although it took me several years to arrive at that place. So I was still at the stage of constant tests and dire possibilities. And I was talking about imaging and the disappearance of the patient, just from my own experience, and talking about how, as I was sitting in places like the Mayo Clinic waiting for yet another test, I had begun reading a raft of new graphic memoirs about health. And Michael Green came to me afterwards. He said, I think I may have the community for you, and pointed me towards the graphic medicine group. I went to my first conference. I don't remember the exact year. It was at Johns Hopkins. And it was intellectually, but also personally and emotionally incredibly important. I think it kind of pulled me out of a spiral. And I have immense gratitude to the working group and the larger community that has formed around it. So since this book, we're beginning to really see there's a book series in graphic medicine. Erin Lacour and Anna Poletti recently did a book for through the journal Biography that I had a chance to participate with some early work I'm doing around chronic health in comics. It's become a growing, but still, I think, appropriately kind of small field. And there's a lot of opportunities to approach graphic medicine from a lot of ways. And I'm like Kay, I'm very interested in also thinking about the tool set of graphic medicine to explore things that we might not think of as medicine, including larger issues of social and environmental justice. The corpus of graphic medicine is kind of interesting in and of itself. There were not a lot of memoirs that came out early around the experience of being ill, of the patient story, of dealing with cancer, as in the case of My Cancer Year, or in the case of 7 Miles a Second. This was a pioneering work about the experience of living with AIDS. And Al Davison's, I think, really extraordinary work very early, so early it risked, I think, not finding a proper market if Alan Moore hadn't kind of reached out and realized how important it was and gotten it out there. Today, of course, the landscape has changed. The other book is over on the left there is Cancer Made Me a Shallower Person, one of my very favorite books of all time because it pushes against the heroic, medical narrative. certainly illness didn't, made me often a person who wanted to read People magazine and watch soap operas, and not the deep, profound thinker I was kind of hoping medicine would do for me. Then there was a raft, like just a huge range of stuff came out in around 2006, 2007, a couple, I think epileptics a little before that. And a lot of them were focused around cancer narratives, not too surprisingly, given that we had already a broad range of cancer narratives in other media that I think made it work. And comics became a place of making that story new, telling it in ways that didn't quite fit with how it had been told in other narrative media. And these are the books that I brought with me to the Mayo Clinic that were my companions and made me feel less isolated as I was going through that experience. Since then, it's been it's remarkable. This is, I think, just a slice of what's on my my growing bookshelf of books in the field dealing with everything from PTSD, eating disorders, the kind of challenges of chronic illness, Parkinson's, mental health and mental illness challenges. And the work is extraordinary. And folks come to it with a wide range of experience as artists. And one of the things that I do think is incredibly important about comics is that one can do a lot with what, many of us stopped drawing because we were told we were not good artists by a teacher or somebody else, or that it was childish stuff to draw in class. And so recovering that power of realizing the expressive force of one's own art as a way of tapping into some really important issues that we have learned or that we're trying to learn. Comics really opens that up. There are some incredibly accomplished artists working in this field. There are also a lot of folks who picked up the pen for the first time in trying to tell their stories. And they have different effects. They have different, they forge different kinds of connections with the reader. But it's also, I think, something as I encourage my students, and we're seeing this in the growing field of what we might call kind of practical comics, of bringing comics into spaces like veterans, hospitals, bringing it to into clinics as a place to help patients, particularly long-term sufferers, begin to tell their own stories, which would be daunting for them in other media. So as Miriam mentioned, I'd been working in this field in kind of small ways, essays here and there, very, very active with the graphic medicine group until a few health issues forced me to kind of step away from conferences for a number of years. And I had this opportunity in 2019 to put together my first kind of solo major exhibition. I've been curating for about a decade with the folks there. The Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum, if you haven't been there, is the largest such institution in the world. We always say that and wait for somebody to correct us. So far, we're kind of pretty sure we're right. Has 3 galleries as well as a massive archival collection. I encourage anybody who gets a chance, come visit us in Columbus. It is a special place that really transforms, I think, for cartoonists and scholars and fans the way we think about them, the medium and its possibilities. So I started this exhibit really focusing on contemporary work. That was where my interest was. I had gotten close with many creators working in this space through my time at the conference or my work at the Billy Ireland. But I also am just naturally a kind of media historian. I was raised by art historians. I was like, what came before? And that's always my impulse. This thing really couldn't have sprung out of nowhere. Its visibility is clearly related to some specific issues that are happening right now in medicine, a particular crisis. But what happened before? First part of the exhibit is now something I'm spending a lot more time with, working on a book on the earlier history of comics in medicine, something that the graphic medicine group, which is very concerned with contemporary urgent issues, doesn't really have a lot of space to explore right now. So I thought, well, I could carry some of that weight for the larger conversation. And it's been an interesting discovery. One of the things that I knew but maybe hadn't fully wrapped my head around is how long graphic narrative has existed. Actually goes back significantly longer than this, but just beginning with somebody like William Hogarth from the early 18th century, who discovered the art of caricature as it came from northern Italy in the late 17th, early 18th century, began doing a series of narratives like Harlot's Progress, which we see here. And one of the things that Hogarth has always been interested in, he was intimately connected with a hospital, first as a poor kid growing up in its shadow, and then as one of its trustees and a muralist who painted a very bizarre mural, actually, in its halls that's still there. He became really interested in medicine and very critical of doctors at the time in pre-modern medicine. You can see here, as our heroine is dying, you can see here the doctors are busy arguing, and here's a little blow up of it. These are actually two doctors that Hogarth knew and was very skeptical of. They are arguing over their various patented remedies while our patient is dying, and the maid or companion is calling for their attention as she dies, but of course they are uninterested, and meanwhile another woman is stealing all of her things. And a representation of the state of medicine, particularly for the poor at the time. Our heroine by this point has fallen on very hard times, but this ongoing commentary on medicine runs throughout Hogarth's work. And in fact, we find it almost everywhere in early cartooning, or what was called at the time caricature. The word cartoon and cartooning doesn't emerge until the 1840s in the pages of Puck magazine. And so here's a series from James Gilray, I think somebody who himself suffered with chronic illness his whole life, and sought out reliefs and pain. This is actually loosely a self-portrait of himself undergoing various remedies and treatments. There wasn't a lot available at the time. You pretty much purge something. So he is being given an emetic, bloodletting, a cathartic. You can see what the effect of a cathartic would be as he sits waiting in agony on the privy, and then the well again at the end, right? There's this recovery. But one of the things I really admire about Gilray is his real interest in thinking about the patient's experience, capturing the pain, the suffering, the attentiveness of the caregiver as well, but also the deep frustration at how inadequate the remedies at hand were at the time. The other thing that comics were doing, or cartooning is doing at this time, is exploring the possibility of metaphor, of visual metaphor and icon. Here's a representation of gout, a figure also from Gilray, that gets picked up by other cartoonists during this period, trying to capture what is the experience of that pain in the foot that gout produces. How do I capture it? Because one of the things we know about pain is that it is the hardest thing to communicate. It is where patient-doctor care breaks down. It is the agony of patients and doctors, their inability to measure pain in any way that allows that transmission of experience from one to the other. And one of the central tenets of graphic medicine has been thinking about how comics can aid that communication. As somebody who's lived with chronic pain, but also chronic mental illness challenges over the course of my career, I also became really interested in the early attempts to represent not just pain in the form of George Cruikshank's The Headache on the left, but also depression. Cruikshank struggled with depression his whole life and found a way of representing it in a widely imitated page from 1823 in the form of the Blue Devils. And you can see all the things that are driving him to despair. It's, again, a self-portrait, driving the artist to despair, burning his own art. The bills are piling up. The kind of self-doubt, the encouragement of these inner voices that are hovering around him to take to the noose or take to the bottle, and so on. So that history is one project I've been working on. The other project has been thinking about comics and time, which is why I'm very excited about Kay's work around grief and time in comics. And I've been very interested in comics time, and so I've been working in particular on that subject and thinking about the ways in which comics can represent the kind of unnarratable aspects of chronic experiences, depression, pain, and so on. Those two projects on chronic time in comics and on the history of comics and medicine are kind of where I am. I think I bounce back and forth between them. And I get inspired by the work of people like Kay, who kind of, when I start having self-doubts, make me want to get back into it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kay and Jared. I guess we'll just start kind of throwing some questions at you, and I will also, while you're talking, open up the chat. So if people have their own questions, we can take those and save them for a little bit later. But I mean, first of all, you have both kind of touched on this, but just to kind of draw your perspectives together and make them kind of speak to each other a little bit more. Could you comment on what the value of graphic medicine is to you, especially in terms of like specific kind of storytelling techniques in comics and that particular medium? Kay, would you like to start on that maybe?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the first things that I want to mention is that I think it's like, as a concept, it's great that it's has led to comics being used prominently in communicating issues pertaining to healthcare, but not just, like the clinical aspects of it, but also socio-political and historical issues. For example, one of the most brilliant short comics I read recently was published last year in the Washington Post, this nonfiction comic called, I don't know if any of you have read it, it's called Searching for Mora. And it's part of a collection about brains, how brains and other body parts were mostly from people of color were stolen by the Smithsonian. It's this really horrific story, and it's incredibly well investigated. And as a part of the collection, they had this heartbreaking, absolutely devastating comic about it. And it went on to, I think, become a Pulitzer finalist. And then it's just one of the many examples, but I really think that comics like this can, like the kind that deeply research, deep dive into certain subjects and are super investigative and makes use of the, like the formal aspects of the medium to make certain things visible. Really well-run comics like this can be great for spreading awareness about complex topics. And just, like just draw a reader in who might have been reluctant to dive into the topic with just words, maybe. So yeah, I think that's something that graphic medicine, I don't think this was explicitly in work of graphic medicine, but yeah, I think that's to me, that's really the graphic medicine.
I agree. I think, the initial impulse of graphic medicine was, and I think, the heart of it still remains very much about thinking about how to make medical outcomes better for all involved. And a lot of the original focus was around the kind of patient-doctor interaction, because, I think that's where the kind of narrative medicine was focused. I think to some degree, narrative medicine remains perhaps too strongly focused solely around that issue. But the minute you start thinking, so I'm here particularly thinking about, I know the NIH is not this utopia that we in the United States think of it as, but our, systematically cruel and inhuman medical system in the United States that turns medicine into a commodity, and that historically and in the present disproportionately discriminates against those who don't have means, but also, all the data shows us that, women, the elderly, young teenagers, and of course, African Americans and other communities of color experience disproportionately worse outcomes. And graphic medicine that's focused solely on the patient-doctor interaction is not going to address that, right? We have to also be looking at larger systematic challenges. And I think comics can do that, right? Comics can scale from the personal to the global in remarkable ways. And we have many examples of it. I think, there are examples of it in even Kay's work that is publicly accessible in her website. The other thing I think that is crucial about comics, and Kay has touched on it briefly, but I think for me, it's become my obsession. It's not, as she said, all media can do remarkable, innovative things. I'm long past my early stage of comics are uniquely powerful, right? All media are, uniquely powerful, but comics do have some, affordances, a word I've come to be skeptical of, but I'll still use it. Comics have some affordances, and one is, of course, in relationship to the ways in which time is represented. And one of the things we know about time, Virginia Woolf wrote about it beautifully 100 years ago in her kind of long essay on illness. Time changes when we're ill. Time changes when we're caring for the ill. And it changes in ways that feel, if we are believing wholly, as we're kind of forced to do in our day-to-day, that the kind of synced global time of late capitalism is the only time that is real. But it also changes in ways that allow us to perhaps see the ways in which, and I think many of us have had this experience, even in serious illness, that we suddenly see the world differently. We see time differently. We see our priorities differently. There are valuable lessons that come back from time as we become time travelers. And because comics spread time out across the page, because comics represent the, what Einstein described in 1905, right? The linkage between time and space in a fairly unique way. Comics allow us to represent and explore and to some degree communicate that remarkable experience of how time changes and becomes linked to space in remarkable ways. I think, Kay, your panels you showed from the COVID comic, which I admire very much, it was in COVID Chronicles, really captures some of that. The kind of space and time relationship of isolation is captured perfectly there. So I do think that comics has a lot to do, not just in the patient doctor caregiver, but the larger illnesses that we're suffering as a society, including, of course, climate change, global inequities. And I think we should not be bracketing them off. I think we should be expanding that lens to think about care in the broadest sense.
Great. And Jared, you mentioned, the graphic medicine, it's not so much a discipline or a field, but it's a community. And I think that kind of community is really kind of impactful when we're talking about things like graphic medicine and these kinds of, illnesses and health issues that impact, broad kind of spectrums of society, right? So yeah, really important stuff. I mean, do you think that graphic medicine can help to raise awareness about healthcare issues that might not necessarily receive attention through traditional media like news media and whatever kind of other media we might kind of think of, and why might that be?
Yeah, I'll just jump in real first. So one of the things I'm really interested in comics and public health. One of the things we learned very quickly at the outset of the COVID pandemic, and sadly we learned it more as the pandemic continued, is that we need more public health. We need more communication about health. We need to think about health as something more than just me and my bodily autonomy, but as community responsibilities. And one of the things that in graphic medicine or graphic public health, if we want to kind of insist on that distinction, is kind of thinking about how comics can communicate the ways in which communities can come together in times of medical crisis, or for those that are living in constant crisis, which is tragically many of our communities, to work together towards better outcomes. We've seen really positive benefits of the ways in which comics can communicate, especially across often communities where there are multiple first languages. Many people are visual learners, myself included, and can, just understand reading a medical journal, which I can do, is a challenge for me, not just because of discipline, but because of other challenges. So opening up other ways of communicating complex knowledge, as Kay pointed to, as her work's doing, taking very kind of complex scientific articles and socio-political kind of readings and translating them into a form that is accessible to a wider audience is very powerful. And these things get circulated in the digital age. They get shared.
Kay, did you want to respond to that?
I Jared kind of like perfectly said. I don't have much to add. I agree with everything he said. I'll just say one more thing, that I think comics are great for visual metaphors and portraying illness because of that. Like that, I was really taken by the image of the monster clinging on to the person's feet to depict pain. And that's the sort of thing comics really, really shine at. And I'm thinking of works like Elodie Duran's Parentheses, and also
beautiful book. That's amazing work. Yeah.
And also Zara Slattery's Coma. It's really so incredible in trying to just sort of visibilize this invisible or chronic conditions. I don't want to, like, again, I don't want to like indulge in hyperboles, but there's really nothing else like it when it comes to. So yeah.
Yeah, nice, thank you. I'm going to kind of combine Anna's question with a question that we kind of had prepared regarding kind of reaching diverse audiences, including those who might not typically engage with comics. But also Anna's point is quite interesting because Anna says that there are, gatekeepers, financial restrictions, and, things that prevent voices from being expressed. And there's also a lot out there as well. It can feel, a bit disorienting maybe. But how do we tell small local stories in a way that is meaningful, I guess, is what Anna is trying to suggest or ask. Hopefully I've interpreted that properly, Anna.
Do you want to go first, Kay?
Yeah, I mean, I really feel that. So right now I'm working as a full-time comics maker, freelance illustrator. It's difficult. It's really extremely hard. As somebody who does make comics for a living, I don't think anybody, including the most well-meaning of people, understand exactly how much time it takes. And to, there's always this question about how do we get graphic medicine works to, appeal to a broader audience outside of, our amazing community here. And I really think that if we want it to reach beyond a certain audience, we need to look at the creator side of things. Who are making these comics? How are they being supported? Those are really important questions at the labor end of things, because it just takes so much work to make a single page of comics. And I don't think we talk about that enough. So sorry, Anna, I don't have any good answers there, but solidarity.
Yeah, so I mean, solidarity for me too. I've been working with a festival here in Columbus for a decade now, and gotten to know many of the, these are mostly smaller creators, not all, but I've just, as I've become friends with them and learned about their experiences and struggles and stories, it is a larger kind of challenge. One of the things I'll say is a couple of things, right? Is that telling local stories to local communities is a value in and of itself. And a lot of our communities now have comics festivals. A lot of them are even for alternative comics, for the kinds of stories that, we're talking about here, independent festivals. Those communities can feel sometimes a little insular, like you're just kind of preaching to the converted, for sure. but it is a way to share work, self-published work, in the form of zines, any format. And those community interactions also is one of the things I love about comics. I always say to people, I went into comic studies for the people first, and kind of stayed because actually the subject is utterly fascinating. But I was like, hey, academics are kind of bumming me out. Why are all the good people going over there? And I just followed them. And I mean, I'd been a comics fan forever. But I think the community aspect, often local communities, at a time when finding community is very hard. Obviously, this doesn't work for all communities, but there's probably a festival nearby. The other thing I'll say is, web comics can be very frustrating. It's hard to know if anybody's going to ever see your work. But don't underestimate the value of putting it out there with the right keywords. People will find it, right? If you're writing about something in a unique experience related to these issues, and people who are in need, people like myself, will find that work, and you just have to kind of trust that it's going to make somebody's life better, make them feel less alone. That's small comfort, but as somebody who's benefited from folks working in a lot of isolation, independence, and I always try and reach out and express my gratitude, but sometimes I forget to. Sometimes I'm too pressed by the struggles I'm dealing with at the time. But that work that's shared freely on the internet makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I mean, Kay, you mentioned the nib as well, and these things are all kind of informed by these broader structures, right? Because the nib doesn't, exist anymore in the form that it was, unfortunately. But yeah, there's always, opportunities to kind of do things on a kind of small scale locally, as Jared mentioned, which is, yeah, I agree, that's really important. A question from Evie, which is a question mostly for Kay, but maybe Jared as well. Comics as thinking. What do you consider the necessary skills for a person to be able to do that? And can anyone do that?
Yeah, I mean, just start drawing comics. That's the beautiful thing about comics. I wanted to teach myself how to draw, and that's why I did it. But you don't have to. I think comics is really one medium where you can, just make things without knowing how to draw. And I think most of us will agree here that there's just so much you can do with the medium with just stick figures. I would recommend looking at Linda Barry's work, Ebony Flowers' work, and also just to get started, this book called Cartooning as Easy as ABC. I'll drop the link in the chat. I use that in my classes all the time, and that'll just really help you just get started. As far as thinking with comics, I have scripts now because of I've started to do things a bit more formally, but before, when I was doing my dissertation, I really did not have a script. I did not have anything written down. I would just actually start drawing, and that's how the entire dissertation came into being. And that's what I really mean by comics as thinking. Like, I would literally think on the page, and if you start doing it, it's just going to flow and you're going to figure it out.
Yeah, and I'll just drop in the chat just a quick image from that comic I mentioned earlier, by the late art. Oops, sorry. I don't know if I'll figure out how to drop it later. But from Cancer Made Me a Shallower Person. She had never drawn a comic before. She got diagnosed with cancer and was like, yeah, I don't have time to write prose. I thought I was going to write prose, but I don't have the energy for it. I'm going to try comics. And she had never drawn before. It is one of the more, I think, effective and affecting comics I've read, right? So it's part of it is the rawness of the art actually contributes to the kind of urgency of the experience and communication. So yeah, absolutely agree. And the great thing about cartoonists, any cartoonists I study over time, their work changes. And that's okay. You don't have to have a finished, polished style. It can evolve over the course of a long, hopefully long career.
Kind of related to that kind of question of, I guess, form and content, Preeti has a question kind of referring to the predominance of graphic memoir within the kind of graphic medicine kind of sphere. Preeti mentions that both of you signal how illness in war, genocide, or structural problems like the lack of healthcare impacts stories of health and sickness. So what other genres and forms of comic narratives do you envision in the field of graphic medicine beyond the graphic memoir? And that's a really great question. Thank you, Preeti.
Hi, Preeti. Preeti's a friend and a former student, off doing amazing things. Yeah, no, I will say I got at a certain point I got memoir burnout. That was what I needed, and then I was like, surely there's other ways of telling the story. So I began seeking out fiction. When David Lost His Voice is one of my very favorite works of very powerful use of graphic fiction to deal with some really important issues about how health and illness affects not just patient, but caregivers and family and community. And that's something I think we lose sight of too often. Care and is needed for far more than just the patient. And caregiving is hard. I'm kind of in the middle of that right now with my mother-in-law who's at end of life, and the impact on, my wife and me and my kids, and, it just expands like ripples in the water when you throw a stone, and we don't talk or think about that enough. There's an isolation that comes with it as well. I also think what Kay talked about, right? The nonfiction work, the comics journalism, that was kind of pioneered by people like Joe Sacco, has really been an important element of kind of graphic medicine.
Yeah, I was just about to say graphic journalism. Joe Sacco has been amazing. Guy Delisle, that's another one. Another reason I'll say that you see more graphic memoirs instead of, I don't know, like deeply researched nonfiction comics is because of publishing trends. It's always harder to sell the latter kind of books than it is to sell memoirs. And maybe the trend will pass and maybe it'll turn around, but there's a technical reason for it. I assure you there are so many creators trying to do that kind of work. It's just not, it simply does not have the support it needs, unfortunately.
Yeah, we need a new nib. Somebody start a new nib, please. Or give them a few $1 million so they can continue to pay their artists, which was a remarkable thing they did for 10 years. So unusual, as comic artists know, to actually be compensated properly for one's work. But yes, publishing trends around the memoir, they sell. And it is, there are good things about that. There's also a way in which, however, the memoir trend, I think, perpetuates the kind of individualism and individualist thinking around these issues, that if we're going to actually solve some of the larger systemic problems, we need to break out of liberal individualism and think through communities and systems. And the memoir doesn't always do that as well as we might wish it could.
Yeah, I mean, there's a comment from Brad, which is quite interesting. It's not a question, but it's an interesting comment that I think maybe Kay, definitely for sure as a kind of freelancer, but Jared, you probably have some insight as well. Brad refers to the double-edged sword for comic creators in the age of the internet. It's the ability and necessity to be your own publicist, which also then ties into kind of broader things like algorithms and like being on Instagram and kind of almost being an influencer to an extent. But yeah, I don't know, Kay, do you have any kind of insights into what that is like?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it used to be easier than this. Most people who know my work know it from Twitter from the olden days, because right now it's a hot mess. And also right now with the rise of generative AI, I know me and a lot of other artists are incredibly skeptical of posting new work. And it's just like has become such a, I don't know, it used to be great for us. It used to be, like anybody could get online and start sharing their stuff. And if it was good enough, people would start taking notice. But right now it's, if you don't pay for like premium subscriptions, or if you do not like, it's just not what it used to be. It has just become harder in my experience.
Yeah, I mean the loss. I mean, Twitter and Tumblr had their problems always. I spent far too much time on Twitter in some bad days, just trying to pick fights with Nazis. I mean, it was never a utopia, but right, it's become almost unworkable, and yet so many cartoonists depend on it for their reaching their communities, right? So it is also a reminder that AI reminds us that all of our work can be stolen and is actively being stolen by for-profit companies, despite OpenAI insisting, "Oh no, we're just a public service." And of course, that these platforms, when they are free, we are the product. We know that, and we forget it over and over. The internet encourages us to forget it. And so the one thing I kind of hope to see emerge is more and more collectives, kind of internet communities and collectives of work that can maybe help amplify each other, because that burden of being your own publicist, publisher, distributor, marketer is is the greatest thing that, in my experience, as somebody who's been hanging around this space for 25 years, it's the greatest thing that leads to burnout, leads to people leaving, leads to people saying, I can't do this anymore. And those are losses that are really hard to replace. It's why the field skews younger, which is important, right? We want new voices, but we lose a lot of voices right at the peak of their careers to burnout, depression, frustration. So we got to find systems. We got to work together again to find ways of sharing the work, making cartoonists have the ability to make a living, and to support the work we value, and to not expect the work to be received for free.
For sure, yeah. There's always going to be these kind of limitations, and we all have to kind of work within the system. But I do think that kind of emphasis on kind of collective action and communities is, the way forward. I guess I'm going to kind of bring it to a close. I do have one more thing that I'd like to kind of ask you both, kind of based on Gaia's question. But for those who are kind of getting started with graphic medicine, what kind of steps would you recommend?
I always say start reading first. There's just so much great work, and actually, if you go to the graphic medicine website, Kevin Wolf, who's here with us, is the book review editor there, and it's an amazing community. They're incredibly generous. There's no gatekeeping in this world, and you can read the reviews, get a sense of the kind of books that might appeal to you. They also cover web comics and other things. Reach out to creators too. It's sometimes they don't have the bandwidth, but it's a very generous community. Kind of just jump in, but read. There's so much, and it really is. You will have a sense of the story you want to tell. Just 10 books in. That's my sense. What do you think, Kay?
I agree with that. All of that really. Reading is I I just remember that like the way I started writing my dissertation was by actually reading, like, I think 150 or so comics at first. Like that's how I got all my ideas from. So reading is a great place to start. And I think as soon as you start reading, you will have this sort of like urge to create yourself. And I would say, like, to indulge that and really do not hold yourself back. I do not care about like the aesthetics of how your like page is looking like that. It does not matter. It'll come to you, or it's fine either way. And also, as Kevin says in the chat, I think reviewing works can be great for like for the community too, if you're up for it. So yeah, do that.
Yeah, and Kevin, you guys are always open to new reviewers helping out. So I know you got a heavy lift as more and more works come out in the field. Is that right?
Kevin's been doing some heavy lifting, so thank you to
Oh
Kevin.
yeah, no, I bet Kevin could use a hand there, and it's great, and it's I go there regularly just to see what I've missed since I last checked, and the field continues to be robust. And one of the things I love about the graphic medicine website and their reviews is they're very expansive in their notion of what counts as graphic medicine. So the best we could do is a memoir about the kind of post-trauma, generational trauma around being, Vietnamese immigrants, and they include that, right? So that's the kind of thing that I think is very important, to take that expansive notion to what graphic medicine can be.
Yeah, for sure. Kevin's put, yes, always looking for reviewers, and an email address there if anybody who's in the meeting is interested. Please do get in touch with Kevin. And thank you again to Kevin for your contributions. I'm going to draw this to a close. Thank you so much, Jared and Kay, for joining us and providing all your insights and answering all these questions. It's been really, really good, really insightful. And so thank you for taking the time.
Absolutely, and reach out to both of us. I'll speak for Kay because I know she's also loves talking about this stuff. Folks have questions, just feel free to contact us. And thanks for your interest in this topic.
Yeah,
thanks for inviting us, Miriam.
Well, thank you for your generosity.
Eirini. Hi, Eirini.
So yeah, I'm gonna kind of draw this to a close. This is the final event in our seminar series, which is sad, but yeah, thank you so much for coming. This has been a really strong way to end what was already a really kind of solid and insightful series of events. Special thanks to LAHRI, obviously, for facilitating the events. Thank you to Eirini and Rick, who have been present throughout all of this kind of organization and delivery. We do have plans to kind of keep going with the dialogue and collaboration. We'd like to develop a more kind of formalized network, so please keep your eyes peeled for more information if you're interested. And we do invite you to, stay connected. So yeah, thank you so much for coming. And yeah, I will see you when I see you.
Thank you, Jared and Kay. Sorry, I just put my camera on.
Thank you all.
And
It's
thanks,
been
Miriam.
lovely.
We'll talk.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye.